Hey everyone, thanks for joining Face to Face. You're all technology people. You understand that sometimes it goes your way, sometimes it doesn't. Today things did not go our way, and we had some pretty serious connectivity issues with our guest. The audio quality was great, the video quality gets pretty shaky some points, but I think this interview was really fascinating, and so I think it's enjoyable as is, and I hope you'll bear with us. Thanks for watching. Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome again to SDVOE Presents Face to Face AV with Justin Kennington. That's me, your host, Justin Kennington. And today we're going to talk about something a little bit outside of Pro AV. We're going to focus on the broadcast or the professional media market. And our guest has a long career in that space. Mr. Michel Proulx, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell us just very briefly about yourself and how you got into what was broadcast and what is now professional media. Maybe tell us why that distinction.
Okay, well, so why that distinction? It's pretty simple. Television is clearly no longer just about broadcast. There are so many platforms that it's being used. So that's why I've stopped using the word broadcast exclusively. So I've been involved in television and radio production my entire career. I was an engineer by trade, and I worked at what was then a broadcaster. They're no longer a broadcaster, but they're a broadcaster initially. And then once I graduated school, I worked for equipment manufacturers that serviced the broadcast industry for 25 years. And then since retiring, I've been doing consulting, working with both end users in the broadcast industry and also some vendors in that industry. And recently, about 3 years ago, naturally, the two industries, the professional media industry and the pro AV industry, are now very adjacent. I'd say they've always been adjacent, but now they're very adjacent. So I've been doing a little bit of work in the pro AV in the last 2 years. So, and I guess that's how
Cool.
we met, right? Through
It
a
is.
video.
It is indeed. 10 years ago, when I was sort of early in my pro AV days, I would cheat. What I would do is every year I would go visit NAB, and I would look around at the technology that they were using in that world, and then I would come back to my day job in Pro AV and pretend like, and bring those ideas and pretend like I thought of them. And I said, hey guys, you know what we got to do is we got to move all this video to Ethernet and get off these matrix switches, because it's felt to me like broadcast has been ahead of Pro AV in this transition away from baseband matrix switch signaling and into IP. Would you agree with that as someone from that side of the fence, or am I just seeing greener grass, on the
Uh,
other side?
it's funny, the greener grass. So just a little funny thing there. So we used to go to NAB, and once in a while we'd sneak over and go to the pro AV shows, right? And I remember once being in Las Vegas a month apart, and it was because I'd gone to NAB and then I'd gone to Infocom at the same time. So we
Yep.
did the same thing. So was the broadcast industry ahead? I think it was certainly at the time. It was certainly bigger, so you could say that. And some of the applications maybe involved more dollars, so maybe it was more advanced because of that. But I think that gap has been narrowing. As far as the transition, if you're specifically talking about the transition to IP, I
Yeah, I am.
believe that the professional media industry started doing IP sooner, probably by 4 or 5 years, maybe, because we've
Yeah.
been doing it. We've been talking about it since I'd say around the time I left Miranda. We were starting to talk about IP in a serious way. And we had met with customers and they were telling us why they wanted to look at IP. So that would have been around 2011, 2012 would have been when, and it didn't take that long for the transition to start sort of gathering speed. Right? So that's how long we've been doing it.
So in Pro AV, what we see is AV over IP starting to displace primarily technology HD-based T, a
Hmm.
point-to-point extension technology, not replacing HDMI, but really replacing the technology
Yeah.
that moves HDMI over distance. What did IP come in to replace in broadcast?
Oh, so definitely it's SDI. And so, when SDI had started in the early 90s, and we had SDI, then we had HD SDI, and we were just starting to see 12 gigabit HDSDI in order to handle the 4K workflows.
Hmm.
So it's at that time, right where 12 gig SDI was starting, that's when IP came in. And one of its reasons for being for some people was, well, if you're doing it on IP, now you can go beyond 12 gigabits, you can go any data rate because IP is a lot more agile in terms of data rates. So that was one of the reasons. But it's right around that time. So it hasn't completely displaced SDI because there's still a lot of SDI being done, and for a reason that I'll contrast a little bit later. But I think SDI will continue for some time, but for the higher end applications and things like mobile production trucks, those great big mobile production trucks, IP is really gained a lot of ground on SDI.
So I feel like I should know the answer to this question, and maybe I do a little bit, but I still want to hear what you say. Why? Why should broadcast have moved from SDI
Yeah,
to IP? I mean, you touched on bandwidth limitations; those can
yeah.
be overcome on a coax, but there's got to be more.
Well, I think, and you're right, and it's a number of things, and I'll start with the least important one. I think broadcast media engineers are very curious people and sort of just wanting to get on that train, and maybe it's a little bit more serious than that, wanting the desire to take advantage of the speed of development and the sheer size of the IT industry. So I have an
Yes.
interesting chart that I've used that I showed at one point. Broadcast was ahead of IT technology in terms of bit rate. Like we went from 270 megabits to 1.5 gigabits, and then 3 gigabits. And for a while, we were moving faster than the IT industry in terms of transmitting data on a wire, right? But then the IT industry just blew right past us, right? And you had
Yeah.
1 gig, then 10 gig, then we're seeing 25 gig and 100 gig. So I think and it wasn't just the technology, it's just that the IT industry were developing these switch fabrics for much, much bigger markets than,
Yep.
than professional media broadcast industry. So I think that was part of it, the desire to take advantage of that industry. So that's one part. But on the end user side, you also had at that point, we kind of maxed out with the size of an SDI fabric. If there's a difference between pro AV and professional media, is in a TV production facility, there's this desire to interconnect everything and interconnect every single device to every single device. And we're getting to the scale with SDI where economically you could do 1,000 by 1,000, but there were customers that we had that wanted to build bigger facilities than that because they wanted every single device to be on the router, because they wanted to be able to assign any device to any production, so that because they wanted to be more agile. And people like ESPN were building these large facilities that were servicing multiple remote sites and things like that. So the scale we're starting to hit a wall with the SDI scale, whereas with IP, scale was gone, right? I mean, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, a big project that I was involved with, I think the router is 6,000 by 6,000 video endpoints. It's huge, right?
Wow.
So scale, and the
Yeah.
scale was there to give agility, to give more flexibility, being able to assign any device to any facility. So I think that's it, scale and wanting to sort of take advantage of the technology that IT was doing.
Wow. So
Yes.
where does broadcast stand with it? Sorry, where does professional media stand with the transition today? Right here in Pro AV, there is a lot of AV over IP going on, but there's still a lot of matrix switching going on and point to point connectivity. Where are we at in
So,
that,
so
early adopter, late adopter curve for pro media?
But actually, I'm going to. Okay, so before I answer the question about where we are on the curve, I
Sure.
think we need to talk about what the transition has enabled, because I think
Okay.
personally, I think this is really important, right? Oh, I've lost you. I've lost your audio.
Oh, we're here.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so
That's
before
okay.
I answer your question about where are we, I'd like to just address another. You asked me, why did the broadcast industry do this, the professional media industry do this? It's what's the transition has enabled, and I think this is really important. IP has made it a lot easier for software based devices. For a lot of the applications, we've transitioned away from purpose built, does one thing piece of kit to a software based environment. And
Hmm.
that's really huge. And so to me, and I say this all the time, transitioning to IP is not about replacing SDI with IP. It's about allowing us to have more software based workflows. That's really what the big gain is, because that will give us yet another level of agility. I talked about agility by being able to reassign any device to any room. Well, what about reassign a resource to be something different, right? Because it's software based. And I think that's the
Hmm.
part. And going to software has enabled virtualization, which has now enabled cloud-based workflows, and the high end of media production is moving very quickly towards cloud-based workflows because that gives you even more agility, right? So I think that's the real big thing. So I don't know that people would have identified I want to transition to IP because I want to go to software, but it's definitely what it's enabled in a big way. And the pandemic accelerated the transition to cloud. So I think that's the biggest win I would say is transitioning to software. It's not just about scale and using IT. It's about transitioning to software. So
Okay, so it seems like the enablement of software solutions almost has been a an emergent benefit of the transition. So have people latched onto that, and has that helped drive the transition even faster, or how is it going? Are people embracing it? Are people holding back? Where are we on that adoption curve?
so first, let me just talk about how the transition to IP. So I'd have to say, and we haven't talked about this yet, but it's really important. Is the biggest difference between IP adoption in the professional media space, the broadcast space, versus what's happening in Pro AV is one of the things that happened early on is the adoption of a single standard across the entire industry. We didn't start off that way. When we started, there were three or four competing alternatives, but somehow the industry got its collective act together and coalesced on SMPTE 2110. And that was huge. Right? Just the fact that they did that allowed the everybody to be working on the same technology base, which really helped drive adoption because now adoption was cleaner. So that happened, and that was quite good. So how's it going? It's not for everybody, and it's definitely for people who have more complex workflows or who are doing more remote production and things like that. They've been going for the IP transition. Uh, it's been difficult because, to be honest, if the biggest difference between SMPTE 2110 IP and SDI is it's an awful lot more complicated. SDI was so simple. You just had a wire, you plugged it in, you didn't have to configure the endpoints. All the configuration was just labeling the ports on the switch, on the SDI switch, labeling the IO. It was super simple. Whereas with IP, particularly with 2110, there's an insane amount of configuration that has to happen. So it's been quite difficult, and I'd say it's been to now a lot more work to build a facility with IP than it would be if you were to build that facility with SDI. Now, some of that was learning curve and skill sets because these are all learning, brand new things that we're dealing with and new complexities and PTP and not just the IP part, but there's a lot of new skills that were required. So some of the harder part comes from that, but the other part is it just plain old comes from the fact that 2110 and IP is more complex. So been more work. It's been harder, but this industry has a lot of engineering talent in it, and it's been good for that engineering talent to take on a new challenge, and it's working out. I take an example: a big customer that I worked with, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, built this brand new, huge facility, big scale, and they've had to do a lot of DevOps type things to automate the configuration of devices because you couldn't go hand by hand configure each one of those endpoints. It's just too big. It would be too difficult. And every time you'd update the switches to do that manually, too difficult. So they've had to take on these new, well, learn these new tools and develop these new practices. And that's been a big part of it. So, and I recognize that smaller customers won't smaller broadcasters who don't have as big an engineering team will have more difficulty with those kind of things. So bottom line, harder.
Okay. You just cited, I mean, in general, the adherence and adoption of a standard as a big reason that the transition has gone through.
Yes.
Generally, the adoption of a standard, specifically 2110. So let's talk about 2110. What's good
On
and
the
what's
phone,
bad, and
Erica.
Sorry,
Sorry, my wife.
what's good and what that's okay. What's good and what's bad about 2110 in terms of what's helped make the adoption easier, and what are things that maybe in hindsight we wish had been done differently.
Yeah, that's a very quite good question actually, and 5 6 years into it, you're starting to hear people talk about that. So originally, just the fact that we had a standard, everybody's happy, and everybody got behind it. So I think initially one of the things that SMPTE 2110 didn't address that really needs to be addressed is the whole control, discovery, configuration part. That wasn't part of the standard. SMPTE 2110 was just about transporting how do you put video, audio, and ancillary data packets on an IP stream. It really, 2110 initially didn't address the whole control layer, configuration layer. That's now come through, not as part of SMPTE. It's some other set of standards. Well, they're not standards; they're recommended practices. This is the AMWA IS series of recommended practices or of implementation practices. They're now coming along, so an adoption of those is getting there. But initially, we didn't have that part, so that made things more difficult at the beginning. So I'd say that was a challenge. Now, what things did we get right? I think just the fact that it addressed audio the proper way. It addressed, you know, format independent video so that you can mix HD and UHD in the same fabric without necessarily worrying about it. All that's good. I'd say what did we with a bit of hindsight or with stepping back, I think the engineers that came up with 2110 that came up, and I'm probably going to get myself in trouble with some people that did some fantastic work, so I don't mean any disrespect, but I think we were video engineers very focused on how video worked in SDI and trying to essentially recreate what we had in SDI and IP. And things are very synchronous and things are very locked down. Whereas I think if we'd stepped back, we would have taken better advantage of things that IP could do, and be a bit more bursty, and allow things that are a little bit looser in terms of the structure of how you paste packets. I think that I think we made it too synchronous in a way. And I don't know if your listeners are old enough or will remember the epic battle royale of the mid '90s, which was ATM versus IP. I remember there was the Wired article, about ATM versus IP, and ATM was very, very rigid, very locked down. You had reserved bandwidth, all these kind of things. Whereas IP was a bit more flexible and agile. And I would say it's as if the video engineers that defined SMPTE 2110, if they were in that battle, they would have been on the ATM side, right, in the ATM camp. And it's kind of the approach. So I think in retrospect, there are probably better ways that we could have used IP and been a bit taken advantage a bit more of IP's looseness or flexibility. I don't know. That's the right way to put it.
And what would that ultimately give us if 2110's timing requirements weren't so strict? Does that make the devices easier to configure? Does it make it easier to implement features? Is it about what network switches and equipment you can use? How would it make life better?
Well, and the configuration of those networks and switches. And I think the biggest difficulty right now with 2110 is everything has to be PTP locked. And PTP, I think maybe the implementations have been a bit too strict, and any hiccup in PTP causes the PTP part. I think is the part where I don't know if it's PTP itself or the implementations of PTP, but that has been a challenge. And I think there are other IP transport formats that have achieved IP transport without such a sort of adherence to something as tight as PTP. But again, that comes back to us being video engineers and wanting to everything to be locked and synchronized at each endpoint, right? So if you look at the way just MPEG transport streams had worked before, because we'd been doing video over IP for many years, right?
Sure.
Not just us, the whole cable and IPTV world. And if you look at how transport streams worked, it's a bit looser with timing and stuff like that. So maybe there were some issues there that could have been avoided. But you know what? If I weigh that, I look and I go, we could have spent another 5 years trying to design the perfect
Sure.
standard.
Sure.
We got there quick. We got the whole industry to lock down on that same method, and we were able to move forward. So I think, maybe what I'm doing here is a little bit too much of the sort of what's it called, the Monday morning quarterback, and it's not really that relevant what I'm saying. But I still think that it's I've talked to many engineers and going, wow, we could I wish we didn't have this. We weren't so synchronous. Then we could do this and things like that. But c'est la vie, as we say, right? And then there's compression. There's compression, and I think in the Pro AV you've got this issue too. So for inside facilities, it would have been nice, both for inside facilities and now for some of these remote workflows that we're doing with remote production and production in the cloud, which are becoming very important. Remote production with the pandemic has become almost universal, right? And then some of that's transitioned to the cloud. But the idea of compression, I think compression is there are now very low latency, very high quality compression possibilities that exist that are not they're not evil. And it would have been interesting if, because a compression format will only be useful if everybody's using the same one, because then you can have that universal interconnectivity. And
Right.
2110 accepts compression, and now SMPTE 2110 you can compress video and transport it over SMPTE 2110, but it doesn't prescribe which compression technique to use, so it's not universally implemented the same way. So we don't have that same sort of interoperability that we have with uncompressed workflows. And so if I had a magic wand, I would go back, and as we're defining SMPTE 2110, I would have said, let's also include a very rigid spec so that everybody's supporting the same thing for compression as well, so that we could do UHD workflows on simpler infrastructures, and just so our switches could be a little smaller. Because if you
Sure.
want to do 1,000 by 1,000 or 3,000 by 3,000 UHD switch, it's not going to be a cheap switch, right? It's going to be a
That's
big switch. So
that's
I
some
think,
serious hardware.
yeah, so that's why I think, if you ask me what did we get wrong or what could have been better, I think having locked down a universal compression format would be useful.
So less rigid timing, more rigid compression would have been nice.
Yeah.
In hindsight, look, nobody's upset at you for having better ideas later. You're not Monday morning quarterback. You're answering. You're answering the questions I ask. It's totally fair.
No, and again, I'll come back to something else though, and this will be a sort of I don't know if it's a dig at the Pro AV market. The Pro AV market has historically, because I've been adjacent to the Pro AV market forever, has historically had multiple formats, right?
Mm-hmm.
And typically, supported by these single big vendors or these small groups of vendors that work together. But there's multiple options, and typically, what you have to do if you're a Pro AV customer, you have to pick a camp and work within that camp, right? So, whereas in broadcast professional media, we've always had this SMPTE thing, and we've always had SDI. Everybody did it the same way in 2110.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, if I had to pick between the two, I'd still pick it with its warts. I would still pick the sort of the single standard approach.
Sure. Well,
Right? And I say this as an end user, right? That's what end users want, right? They want the ability to pick, the best product, no matter which vendor it comes from, and be able to connect it with that other product from that other vendor. And I think that's a big luxury to have. So I wouldn't give that up.
There's something every good product manager knows about not letting perfect be the enemy of good. And
Yeah,
I think that's the story here is
yeah,
okay, looking back a few years later, we could have fixed this, we could have fixed that, but we wouldn't have anything. Better to have
yeah,
something that has enabled this transition, as you say, warts and all.
yeah,
And you've started to touch on Pro AV. That's the last topic I want to get to. I
yeah,
would note that SDVOE has looser timing requirements and stricter compression requirements than
yeah.
2110. So I thought that was an interesting parallel.
But then I go, but yes, but it's not. It's one of those. It's one of the options I have in Pro AV, and there are two or three other
Sure.
options that as a customer I would have. So you're right. You've technologically speaking, you've got it more right um, with SDVOE, but it's one of multiple flavors. And then there's another
And
thing that I've
we're
come
working
back.
on that. Don't worry. We're going to get rid of those others.
Hmm, good luck with that.
It's your last piece of advice. You want what was it? Tighter compression, looser timing, and not so many options. So we've got two out of the three. We're working on that not so many options thing.
Well, okay, but there's a fourth that I'm going to challenge you with,
Uh
Jason,
oh.
and
It's fine.
it
We'll
goes
edit this
back to
out.
something.
I'm
Pardon
just
me?
kidding. Go ahead. I said it's fine. We'll edit this out. I'm just teasing. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so it goes back to something I said earlier, which is software, right?
Yeah.
Software based. I think one of the I said it, and it remains true, and it's going to be, I think, more true going forward, at least for the professional media broadcast. For the see, I can't even say broadcast. That's how difficult that is to
Yeah.
say. Um, we are in the professional media, and maybe this doesn't apply to Pro AV, but we are moving more and more to software based things, and um, I think that that's important. And we've had this conversation before. One of my first consulting gigs in the Pro AV market was with an end user that was looking for. They were they had large parks, wrong word, it's a French word, but large rendering devices. They had many rendering devices that are
Yep.
software based devices, and they wanted a direct IP integration into those software based devices. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess the difference between broadcast and Pro AV in this case is that I would say that in broadcast production, more of the devices can become software. There's very few devices that can't be software. Whereas perhaps in Pro AV, you've got more of these endpoint converters and things like that. Doesn't make sense for those to be software necessarily. But the big processing engines, the things that can render, the big uh, playback engines and the big processing engines, those could nicely become software based, or we're
Absolutely.
the big one of the last remaining ones in the professional media broadcast space is the big production switcher, right? That had to be a big honking piece of hardware with a big keyboard to operate it.
Yep.
Well, the keyboard remains, but
But that's
at
it.
IBC this year we saw 7 or 8 fairly complete, well-rounded solutions to do all of the audio video mixing, the keying, playback of clips and all that kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff in a software-based solution. And
Sure.
that's a big enabler, because that's a big honking piece of hardware that, if you can use it, you can share it more quickly, or reconfigure it to do something else, or split it up into two because you're doing two smaller productions.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big deal. So I'd
No,
say,
I completely agree with you that
yeah,
eventually software eats the world, right? Ask any Pro AV professional, and they're going to tell you, how much of your life today is dealing with Zoom rooms and Teams rooms, and how
yeah,
was that 5 years ago, right? That's a story about software taking over in Pro AV as well. You may
yeah.
be answering my last question already, but it is, what can Pro AV learn? Broadcast has been a few years ahead in this transition. Pro AV is deep into our transition to IP now. If we're smart, we look at what other people are doing, right? What do they say? It's easy to learn from your own mistakes. The trick is to learn from other people's mistakes. So
Yeah.
what can Pro AV learn from broadcast and this transition to IP?
Okay, well, I think if I think of trying to apply what we've done in IP and in professional media space, it's I said it earlier, it's been very complicated. It's been very complex. It requires a lot of configuration, and to me, that doesn't seem as compatible with the Pro AV. When I think of Pro AV, yeah, I understand some of the Pro AV installs are permanent installs,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot more of them are sort of, it's a show for a few, or it's an event for a few days or a few hours or whatever. So I think things need to get simpler. I think you need to focus on having it be simpler, because yes, we there's the learning curve part, and all of the pro AV engineers will have to become a lot more IT savvy, and that needs to happen anyways. But I think the tools we need to hide away, abstract away some of that complexity.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's going to be too difficult, and it won't be a good experience. I really think Pro AV values plug and play a lot more than the professional media space does, and I think we
Yeah.
need to get a lot closer to plug and play.
One of the
Meaning, I just show up, I plug a device in, I see the device, I can start using it right away. I don't have to configure it and check a whole bunch of IP addresses and things like that. I think that's something that needs to happen
one of
before
I
it can
think the
happen. So
key differentiators between the two markets is the sort of ultimate end user, right? In a
yeah,
professional media environment, in a broadcast environment, the end user is a trained broadcast engineer, right? This is his or her job all
yes,
day, every day. The ultimate
yeah,
end user in Pro AV is, just some salesperson who wants to come in and show PowerPoints. That's
yeah,
how I
that's
describe it. This is not a trained engineer in audio video, and that becomes a key difference in understanding, how to think about AV systems in Pro AV versus broadcast. I'm sorry, I'm going to call it
no,
broadcast still.
actually I hadn't thought of it that way, but it's an excellent point. And actually now I'd sort of reverse it back, because as broadcast becomes professional media, meaning that we're using audio video production to hit more
Mm-hmm.
applications, right? Not just the channels on a on a on our TVs, but we start hitting. I think our end users will become more like the Pro AV and
Interesting.
end users, which are less sophisticated people, less technologically oriented people. So
Yeah.
we'll also need to make it simpler. So I think your point now, maybe it's that it's the professional media engineers that will need to learn from those, or the vendors will need to
Yeah.
learn the same lessons as Pro AVs, so that we can make it simpler for our end users. Because it's the same thing, by the way. It's like when we set up these little, one of the things at any major production facility is you have these permanent studios that are there, and they're all wired and all set up. And you just come in with the cameras, plug them in, and do the show. But increasingly, I was just at a facility yesterday where they were having like sort of a town hall sort of little production in the lobby, and there's a bunch of equipment that got slapped on tables and plugged in. And I'm sure it would have been nicer if the operational people could just do much of that themselves. They didn't have to have a big team to support them.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think
That makes sense.
that's a reality.
Yeah, we had a guest on a few weeks ago talking about sort of internet broadcasting in a home studio kind of concept, and the idea was, look at what technology has enabled, right? What used to require a couple of live studio engineers to produce, can now be done by a talented host and some smart software. And
And the tool, and I think,
there's a
yeah, and
democratization to that I think is important, but it
yeah,
relies on software and experience that's
simple,
really easy to use.
and it relies on simplicity. Just
Right.
just it has to be simple. I mean, and I think, to be honest, the pandemic really has driven some of that home, because
Yeah.
most broadcasters had to send a bunch of kit to people's homes because the talent was at home.
Yeah.
And that sort of, and we're using vmix right now. Well, the professional broadcast industry is using vmix a lot,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they're using tools that they weren't using before. And now it's a question of, can the high end tools sort of come down and become that level of simplicity, that level of flexibility? And I think that's the real challenge for the vendors in this industry, is to become more software and become more simple.
Yeah. Michelle, this has been a great conversation. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you for sticking it out with us despite our technical challenges for the day. But I think it was a really valuable conversation. So thanks for joining, and thank you for watching. Have a great evening.
Okay, well, thank you again for the invite. I thoroughly enjoyed it myself. So thank you, and thank you everybody. And maybe I'll see you at InfoCon.
Awesome. We'll see you in Florida. Good night, everyone.